Introduction to the Book of Ezra. The original Book of Ezra in the Hebrew Bible included the Book of Nehemiah in it, commonly distinguished as a single book, Ezra-Nehemiah. The two became separated with the first printed Jewish rabbinic Bibles of the early 16th century following late medieval Latin Christian tradition. The Book of Ezra gives an account of Judah's post-Exilic return from Babylon to Jerusalem. The book bears its author, the famous scribe-priest's name, Ezra, as its title. Before I introduce you to the Book of Ezra, let me give you a brief historical background of the setting. History. Constantly, through his Old Testament prophets like Micah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, God told his people that if they chose to break their covenant with him, he would allow other nations to take them into slavery. In spite of God's repeated warnings from the mouth of his prophets, Israel and Judah chose to reject their God and participated in the worship of foreign gods and followed abominable practices which accompanied idolatry and apostasy. True to his promise, God brought the Assyrians and the Babylonians to issue his chastisement upon wayward Israel and unfaithful Judah. In 722 BC, the Assyrians deported the 10 northern tribes who occupied Israel and scattered them all over their empire. Several centuries later, between 605 BC and 586 BC, God used the Babylonians to depopulate Jerusalem, destroy the Jerusalem temple, and chasten his people with 70 years of captivity in Babylon, Jeremiah 25:11, because Judah persisted in her unfaithfulness to the covenant. During this 7 decades in exile, 48 years under Neo-Babylonian rule, 21 years reign of Darius the Mede, who was appointed the Babylonian monarch, and 1 year of Cyrus, who overtook the Babylonian empire, the Jews were always hoping for God's deliverance and restoration of Israel. As we read the book of Ezra, we will see God's providence and mercy in bringing the Judahites back to Jerusalem from Babylon. You will be fascinated and wonderstruck to see how God moved imperial rulers and foreign kings like Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes to favor his people in bringing them back from captivity. You will be amazed at God's sovereignty over the world and its rulers, and at God's faithfulness to his chosen people. Let us see how imperial rulers helped in God's mission of bringing the Judahites from Babylon. During the time of Ezra, the Persian Empire had reached its greatest extent of glory, engulfing nearly the entire Near East. In 539 BC, while the Jews were in Babylonian captivity, Babylon fell to the Persians. History says that the legendary Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC without a fight and then took its king Nabonidus prisoner. The fall of Babylon was complete when the empire came under Persian control, thus putting an end to the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The next year, in 538 BC, Cyrus issued a decree, Ezra 1:1-4, that the Jewish exiles were free to return to their ancestral home. The book of Ezra begins with this decree of Cyrus, a heathen king who was unknowingly doing God's bidding to punish the Babylonians for their wickedness and to liberate the Jews from captivity. About the post-exilic return. Just as there had been 3 waves of deportation from Jerusalem to Babylon, 605 BC, 597 BC, and 586 BC, so there were 3 post-exilic returns from Babylon to Jerusalem. Their return from the 70-year Babylonian captivity spanned over approximately 9 decades. The Book of Ezra provides an account of the first two returns of the Jews from Babylon to Jerusalem, first in 537 BC, led by Zerubbabel, the second 79 years later in 458 BC, led by Ezra, and the Book of Nehemiah contains the account of the return of the third group of Jews to Jerusalem, along with Nehemiah, 14 years later in 444 BC. The 10-chaptered Book of Ezra can be divided into two major sections, chapters 1 to 6 and chapters 7 to 10. 1. First group of returning exiles in 537 BC and their rebuilding of the temple. 538 BC to 515 BC, a period of 23 years, Ezra 1 to 6. This initial group numbered 49,897. Ezra chapter 2 verses 64-65 returned under Zerubbabel and Sheshbazzar in 537 BC when Cyrus issued a decree. The rebuilding of the house of God in Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel and Joshua son of Josadak in its original site was vital for this group. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah were supporting them. The foundation of the temple was laid in 536 BC, Ezra chapter 3. However, they had to face a lot of opposition strong enough to stop their rebuilding project. The narrative in the Book of Ezra reveals a 17-year struggle faced by the returning exiles to restore the temple. At this period of time, when they struggled with discouragement and fear, Zerubbabel found his strength in God and wisely motivated the Jews to finish the task. Their faith and enthusiasm were re-established and reconstruction resumed in 520 BC, and the temple was subsequently completed, dedicated and back to service of God in just 4 years in 516 BC. Since it was seasonable to commemorate their deliverance out of their bondage from Babylon, they celebrated the Passover, that is, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, with joy in 515 BC because the Lord had filled them with joy in completing this great task. What was the need to rebuild a temple if there was so much opposition? Let me tell you the reason. Upon return to Jerusalem, the Jewish community were under threat from the non-Jews living there. So, they were struggling to maintain their identity as a people of the Lord and to claim their ancient entitlements because they faced internal and external pressures by the Assyrians and non-Jews who had settled in Jerusalem when they were out in Babylon. The Judahite returnees had been deprived of the outward symbols and supports of the Jewish religion and so felt insecure. Because of the severe moral and religious challenges, it was necessary that they have the Jerusalem temple rebuilt as an identity to remain a distinctive people faithful to the Lord. Since temple is the first and indispensable mark that the Lord is once again the center of worship in Jerusalem, the ancient Davidic capital, it was necessary that it be rebuilt and all the outward symbols restored so that they could live as God's distinctive people in their own land. 2. Second group of returning exiles in 457 BC and their spiritual revival. 458 BC to 433 BC, a period of 25 years. Ezra chapters 7 to 10. Between the 6th and 7th chapters of Ezra, there is a gap of 57 years, extending from the 6th year of Darius to the 7th year of Artaxerxes. Between Darius and Xerxes ruled King Xerxes. The events of the Book of Esther take place in this time when Xerxes, who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush, reigned. 57 years passed over in total silence. 57 years later, in 458 BC, Ezra was commissioned in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, to go to Jerusalem to teach the laws of God to anyone who did not know them, make sacrifices, and establish, enforce, and reinstitute the Mosaic law. Ezra's royal commission authorized him to bring 2,000 Jewish exiles and their families to Jerusalem in 457 BC. When Ezra arrived back in Jerusalem, he discovered that God's people had compromised their faith by intermarrying with pagan neighbors and serving other gods, thus being led to apostasy. This practice was forbidden because it tainted the pure covenant relationship they shared with God, and it placed the future of the nation in danger. Committed to teaching and practicing God's word, Ezra spiritually awakened the Jewish people and called the people back to covenant loyalty and obedience to the Mosaic law, thus sparkling a spiritual revival in Jerusalem. Ezra also set a pattern for God's people to prayer and fasting. Date written. The Book of Ezra was written between 450 BC and 420 BC. However, the events in the book covers a period of approximately 1 century, 538 BC to 433 BC. Theme: Faithfulness. Faithfulness to the Lord, both in keeping the Mosaic law and in worship, and faithfulness of the Lord in bringing physical restoration and spiritual revival. Though the nation of Israel is pictured as cut down almost to its roots, the book of Ezra shows how God restored his people into his fellowship, how it gained new vitality from its nourishment of the Mosaic law, and how people played a central role in this work of renewal. Leadership style of Ezra. Ezra, a spiritually zealed teacher well versed in the law of Moses, had a very different leadership style. It is called visionary leadership. By definition, leaders with visionary leadership style have a vision for a mission. They have clear, inspiring, strategically planned long-term goals that take their organization forward because they have a mission that allows progress and development. They empower each member to take action on the plan at the organizational, team, and individual levels. The journey with a visionary leader is far-reaching and deterministic. We often think of scribes as those working behind the scenes in dusty, dimly lit rooms, diligently copying and recopying ancient manuscripts. However, Ezra was more than that. He lived in the most critical period in Jewish history, when Judah was in Babylonian captivity and when their nation, city, and temple were in ruins. Gathering the people and rebuilding a nation indeed was a great task. Such times require leaders of vision and faith. Through God's intervention and Ezra's leadership skills, he brought the second batch of people back to their ancestral land and also stood up as a reformer in reinstituting the Jewish community on the basis of the law of Moses, that is, the Torah. Because of his determination and boldness in implementing his knowledge in the law, his hard work, his faith, and his spiritual zeal, Ezra transformed the critical period in Jewish history to the most glorious period in Jewish history. The world is in need of someone to remind them of God and to lead them to God. They need a determined leader who will uplift them from bondage and lead them back to God's will and worship. That someone is the most wanted person. He is a leader. Such a leader was Ezra. Ezra proves that excellence in leadership requires submission to God's sovereignty, a vision, courage, humility, and decisiveness in reminding the people about the magnitude of their task in the time of setbacks. Author: Ezra, meaning Jehovah helps. Ezra was a priest from the line of Aaron, Ezra 7:6, and a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, Ezra 7:12. It's interesting to note that once Ezra appears on the scene in chapter 7, that is after his arrival in Jerusalem in 458 BC, the author switches from writing in the third person to first person because he is directly involved at this point in the narrative. Linguistic analysis has shown that the first person and the third person extracts resemble each other, making it likely that the same author wrote both. This lends credibility to Ezra being the author of the Book of Ezra. What other books did Ezra write? There is a strong priestly tone and uniformity of language, style, and ideas in 1st and 2nd Chronicles and the Book of Ezra. The similarity between these books in its language and literary style confirms that the chronicler, as scholars have long referred to the author of the books of Chronicles, is Ezra the scribe. Also, the concluding verses of 2nd Chronicles chapter 36 verses 22-23 are virtually identical to the beginning verses of Ezra chapter 1 verses 1-3, affirming Ezra's authorship of both. Genre: it's a historical narrative in straightforward prose to illustrate the theme of restoration. They do not include legal imperatives or prophetic visions. It includes many quotes from official documents. Structure: the contents of the Book of Ezra are structured in a theological rather than chronological order. Coming back to the Lord's presence first, the temple must come next, then the purifying of the community last. What are the 52 verses written in Aramaic from the records? 7 purported Persian decrees of kings or letters to and from high officials are quoted in Ezra. 1. The decree of Cyrus, Ezra 1 2-4. 2. The accusation letter of Raham and Shimshai to King Artaxerxes, urging him to stop the building of Jerusalem, Ezra chapter 4 verses 11-16. 3. The reply of King Artaxerxes commanding that building operations be stopped, Ezra chapter 4 verses 17-22. 4. A copy of the letter that Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates sent to King Darius, complaining that the Jews are rebuilding their temple and at the same time giving the king a concise history of that most interesting building, Ezra chapter 5 verses 7-17. 5. The memorandum of Cyrus's order that was searched from the archives during the period of King Darius in regard to the building of the temple in Jerusalem and the restoring of the vessels of silver and gold, Ezra chapter 6 verses 2-5. 6. The letter of Darius in reply to Tattenai, the governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and the other officials of that province, Ezra chapter 6 verse 6-12. 7. An authorization letter of Artaxerxes I to Ezra the priest to officially establish the Mosaic law and ritual in Jerusalem and Judea, recognizing the temple in Jerusalem as the one legitimate seat of worship of the God of Israel and appointing Ezra as the religious head with full powers, Ezra chapter 7 verses 12-26. These documents are similar to contemporary non-biblical documents of the Persian period. If 67 verses are written in Aramaic and only 52 verses out of these are quoted from official documents, why are the remaining 15 verses written in Aramaic? Bible scholars have theorized that Ezra continued to write in Aramaic after quoting the Aramaic documents. Ezra wrote in Aramaic to demonstrate that he understood the language and was accurately interpreting the correspondence. Practical application. The Book of Ezra is a chronicle of hope and restoration. For a Christian whose life is scarred by sin and rebellion against God, there is great hope that ours is a God of forgiveness, a God who will not turn his back on us when we seek him in repentance and brokenness. The return of the Israelites to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple are repeated in the life of every Christian who returns from the captivity of sin and rebellion against God to find in him a loving and welcoming home. No matter how long we have been away, he is ready to forgive us and receive us back into his family. The opposition of the adversaries of God to the rebuilding of the temple displays a pattern that is typical of that of the enemy of our souls. Satan uses those who would appear to be in sync with God's purposes to deceive us and attempt to thwart God's plans. We are to be on our guard against such deceivers and refuse to be fooled by their smooth words and false professions of faith. God can move the hearts of secular rulers and foreign leaders also to stand for you and to restore you. So, take time today to acknowledge God's sovereignty and mercy in your life. Be assured of God's faithfulness to his chosen people and the surety of his promises. Recommit to him your trust, your love, and your obedience, and see God beautifully working in your lives. God bless you.